Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, April 16th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about President Biden's pathway to victory if the election was held today. Now, yesterday I made a video talking about the political betting market odds and how they have been shifting very heavily in favor of President Biden, not only on the national level, but also on the statewide level. And I expected to see many of these comments, and I did see a few of them that discussed genuinely asking, what is the pathway to victory for President Biden, considering that on the national level in opinion polling data, on the statewide level in opinion polling data, Donald Trump is defeating Joe Biden in nearly every single battleground state. And if the polls were true and off as they were back in 2020, President Trump would win in a decisive victory. And I would say that looking at the lens of just this election through, solely polling data is not what we do here. And I think what we've understood is that there are so many different factors at play and that polling is just one of them that doesn't necessarily have to influence the way that somebody votes, but influences the way that we understand this election and understand which candidates are going to win. And the reason I've been largely much more optimistic on the side of President Biden, figuring out that these polls may not be as representative of the true election results we will see this coming November, is because a bunch of different factors interspersed between the last election and this one have made me trust polls a little bit less, and also seem to suggest that maybe there is an underestimation for President Biden. Now, our 2024 electoral map, which we have yet to fill in here, really comes in at a very, very interesting point. Because we are with the same exact candidates that ran back in 2020, we have to face that the American voter has already made their decision on these two 4 years ago. People have already made a decision about Trump versus Biden before, and the question is now not who they're going to choose, but who's actually going to change their minds. For 95% of Americans, they're not going to change their minds. They're either going to vote for the same candidate they did in the last election, or they're just not going to vote at all. For that 5%, and potentially even smaller, depending on the state we're looking at, those voters are the voters that the Democratic and Republican parties are looking to sway left and right. And uniquely enough, because President Biden and President Trump are back in this race together, we actually have seen polls over the past 3 years that have given us a rematch scenario, and we know now that President Trump is at one of his highest points when it comes down to overall trend lines, but now is starting to see a reduction in support compared to what he has experienced over the past 6 months. Now, when people ask me, where is it that you see a potential Biden pathway to victory, the avenues at which I see them really aren't that extensive. I've talked about the ways that President Biden could win re-election, and to be quite frank, it's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be something that is just painstakingly obvious. While there certainly are pathways, for instance, through an extensive use of Sun Belt, Rust Belt, Southern states, obviously that makes sense. President Biden, if he was to win the remaining 211 electoral votes, which in theory, if this was some type of massive victory election for Joe Biden, would be possible. It is certainly not the most practical outcome of this election cycle. What I'm going to characterize are all of the states that Donald Trump and Joe Biden won by 5 points or more in the last election, respectively. That means we're left with just 123 electoral votes that were decided by a margin of less than 5%. But what we know about Florida with its 30 electoral votes is that Donald Trump is going to win that state. It's going to be a state that Republicans do well in, not only on this level, but Rick Scott, the senator who was up in 2018, is now up again in 2024. In fact, he won his first race just 6 years ago. And so it'll be interesting to see if he holds on by an even larger margin than he won by in 2018. I estimate that he will, probably by substantially more, considering he won by 0.2% in the last election here. But we're left with 93 electoral votes that are truly going to be the pathways forward for President Biden and President Trump. Now, I've told you about my different thoughts on this election cycle. My most recent prediction has Donald Trump winning the election. But again, the focus of this video isn't about, who wins this election on the baseline. It's about how Biden wins if the election was held today. And I think there is a way for that to happen because things are so up in the air. A month ago, I wouldn't have agreed with you. 2 months ago, I wouldn't have agreed with you if you told me that. But I do believe it today. And I think the reduction in support we've seen for President Trump on the national level is indicative of a change in opinion. I mean, you can even take a look for yourselves. Take a look at the data and tell me that this is not turning the tides in favor of President Biden, at least in the slightest. What I've captured here are the polls from January 25th to February 25th, and in that entire time span, just 4 polls disagreed with a consensus of nearly 20 that Donald Trump is in the lead on the national level, and 3 of them have Biden ahead, and 1 shows a tie. And when we do the same exact thing over the past month now, you can see here that significantly more, nearly half of them either show Biden ahead or a tie, which is actually now more than half if you throw that into the equation. But overall, you're seeing that there certainly is a change, right? March 11th to April 11th. What you've seen here is a reduction in support, even when you take a look at the individual polls, for instance, that are releasing new results. You are seeing better results for President Biden, and overall, the average here has improved. It's improved in Wisconsin, it's improved in Michigan, it's improved across the country. So let's get to it. How is it that President Biden wins this election, even if the numbers aren't looking too hot? Well, it comes back to this effect of the 2022 midterm elections, where our estimations were far off. I incorrectly predicted that Dr. Oz would become the next senator from the state of Pennsylvania. I also said that, I expected Republicans to do well in a number of governor and House elections. The House I wrote off from the beginning, and, fairly so, right? Democrats did, in fact, lose the House, but equally, not by the margin I expected. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that after 2016 and 2020, the underestimation of Republican support made me jaded in believing some of the data that we're seeing here from the mainstream pollsters. What I have come to understand is that there isn't an election cycle where we can definitively say that there is a severe underestimation of either party that will continue until the next cycle. Because in 2016, that didn't necessarily continue in 2018. In 2020, it certainly did not continue in 2022. And the question is now, though, do we have an underestimation of Republican support or Democratic support? I believe, given a post-Dobbs decision, given where we are with all of the data that suggests, in contrary opinion to the polls, that Biden is on track for victory here, does counteract my belief in these polls fundamentally. And so what that tells me is that I am confident that if Biden is up by 0.1 in Pennsylvania, he is probably up by 1, which is why I think if the election was held today, Biden wins Pennsylvania. But that isn't to say that Biden will win every state. I don't think a victory today would be super easily won. I think it's going to be something that would require, Democrats turning out the right bases and also tempering younger voters, tempering voters who may have been engaged. In fact, some cases voted for Biden back in 2020 that are willing to sit this race out because of how they feel about domestic and international issues and conflicts. That could be a very, very big reason, should President Biden lose the election, why he does. These are things we talk about. These are things we analyze. These are things that matter to voters and could be very influential in this cycle. However, given what we've seen from the Biden admin, given what we've seen from the Biden campaign, there may be a change in rhetoric. There may be a change in official policy and stances. And I think, again, should the election be held today, it would require a temperament of these voters here, giving them enough that they're willing to vote for Biden, but it wouldn't necessarily be enough to make them as excited as it was back in 2020, which is why I think if the election was to be held today, it could not be through a pathway to victory as easy or as large as the one back in 2020. And to already make that much more difficult, in fact, the electoral vote count with this state going to the GOP simply cannot be as large as it was for Joe Biden as it was in 2020. With North Carolina going red, that might have been an automatic given if you're looking at this from strictly the political analyst lens, but it means that Biden is not making any gains. Everything left on this territory are Biden states. These are all states that he won in 2020, many of which I think Democrats have been eyeing up for quite some time, but Biden was the one to do it. But the last time these states went blue wasn't too far off, with the exception of Arizona and Georgia. Arizona 96, Georgia 92, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan 2012, Nevada 2016. And so there are pathways here. And I think the easiest option, first of all, is to say we're going to completely write off Georgia and Arizona. Well, that may not be necessarily wrong in terms of what the actual result might be. I want to give a little bit more context as to why I think maybe these polls are also underestimating Democratic support in these states. But underestimation doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a Biden victory. For instance here, In the state of Arizona, Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by 4.5%. Do I think that's true? Absolutely not. I do not believe that Donald Trump would defeat Joe Biden in this state by 4.5%. Remember when Kari Lake was supposed to be the next governor? Remember when all these numbers were telling us that Blake Masters was going to be the next senator? The Republicans were going to completely take back everything they have in the state, and then the state legislature narrowed down to one-seat majorities in both the House and the Senate? These things don't just happen because of all of a sudden Democrats got lucky. No. Democrats have a base in Arizona, and a base that I do not believe is as Republican as it is being made out to seem. However, a 4.5% lead for Donald Trump is a bit too much of a hurdle that I think Joe Biden would win the state today. I think Arizona is a state that fundamentally is purple and can swing back and forth. But I don't think Trump is that guy who will do it this coming November. Today, though, I think he can. I do believe because of issues like immigration. You find that also, too, it isn't just Sunbelt states. It isn't just border states that care about issues like immigration. It's the entire United States. But in Arizona specifically, you have seen a reversion in support amongst Hispanic and Latino voters in this state and in Texas and New Mexico and Nevada. Again, reasons why they're not, going to be as favorable to Joe Biden. New Mexico just has too much of a margin in favor of Biden to lose that. But still, we could possibly see some reversion here. I think Arizona is going to go to Trump. And I think, a motivating factor behind this too, beyond just the shifts amongst Latino and Hispanic voters here, is that I think looking at where Democrats need to turn out bases, they need to turn out Maricopa County. You're talking also about places like Arizona State, college campuses, which arguably in a state like Arizona may not necessarily be as pivotal as they are in states like Michigan with Ann Arbor, or Pitt in Pennsylvania, or Penn State, right? Where, on the ground efforts might matter a little bit more when it comes down to college campuses there. They do matter. But again, it is that decreased enthusiasm between Latino and Hispanic voters, young voters, and general discontent from some independents that if a combination of the three was to arise, as I think it does in North Carolina, as I think it does in Arizona, I think there could be an opportunity for loss here for Joe Biden. And given where the polls are, as much as I would love to say on the side of someone who is, really trying to get this right, that, maybe I don't need to be told what the polls are telling us are going to be for this election to be predicted. Sometimes I like to be a contrarian in the sense that I expect the polls sometimes to be wrong, at least in one regard. I don't think they're wrong in Arizona. I do think, though, the margins are off. But Joe Biden, I think, is going to lose the state. I think it's going to go back to Donald Trump very narrowly. It was so close back in 2020 that the security here really isn't that high. But Georgia, I have a little bit different of a problem here. Now, Georgia, the numbers aren't as good for Donald Trump. And, let's not try to act like they are. But I will say, the only thing I think keeping Biden afloat here is the growing population in the Atlanta metro area, which I think is enough in some cases to keep the state blue, but not enough in this cycle. What 2022 showed me was that a candidate, even as bad as Herschel Walker, still had around 48 to 49% support. That's a problem for the Democratic Party. At least in a state like Arizona, that wasn't the case, and even then, I expect Donald Trump to win the state. But Georgia is not going to be a state won easily, and it's certainly not going to be a state won if Joe Biden's not winning Arizona and not doing that much better across the United States. But with these remaining 31 toss-up electoral votes, the question is now, where is this pathway to victory? Well, I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off. The pathway to victory fundamentally does lie in Wisconsin and Michigan, but it can be accompanied by a state like Nevada. I am so uniquely interested by this state because it has been such a state that Republicans have been trying for, honestly in a way that Democrats have been fighting for North Carolina. And yet in a year like this one, the polls seem to suggest that it's a narrowing of the race for Joe Biden, but it also seems to show similar margins of victory for Donald Trump. Now, my problem with this is that besides these polls, the data doesn't check out. When you take a look at my expectations for what some of these demographic groups might vote like, especially a reduction in support amongst black voters, a reduction in support amongst Hispanic voters, a slight reduction in support amongst young and AAPI voters here, Joe Biden wins the election with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but surprisingly enough, also Nevada. It's one of those states where there's a ceiling for the GOP, and it requires Joe Biden to lose by more because he's getting under what he got back in 2020. That is the way Joe Biden loses that state. But Nevada is not a conservative state. And even though we have seen reversions in support amongst Latino and Hispanic voters here, I do think based on my own estimations and based on the numbers that we've inputted here, where we've taken a look at them and we've understood a little bit more about what demographics mean for overall election outcomes, that surprisingly enough, I would throw Nevada in the column that carries Joe Biden across the finish line if the election was held today. If Clinton won it, he very well may too. And Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Nebraska second would likely follow suit. And so looking at this map, 276 to 262, this is the pathway to victory for President Biden should the election be held today. Should they drop everything and focus all their time in 24 hours on key and crucial battleground states, it's about the Clinton defense and the Clinton structure on top of Biden's blue wall. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.